Racers and horsepower freaks love Whipple superchargers because they just make power. And recently the company has come out with their new 3-liter supercharger. It may not sound like a big deal because it's only 1/10 of a liter bigger than the old version, but the new 3-liter gets rid of the jack shaft and you're supposed to be able to spin it higher for even more boost. So today on the Horsepower Monster, we're going to find out for ourselves. We'll get in depth on the supercharger in a moment, but first we need to lay out the details on the engine that will be spinning it up. To make the most of the new Whipple, the guys at Prestige Motorsports wanted to make sure that they had something that could certainly take advantage of the boost provided. So they decided to do what they do best and make big cubic inches. By the way, this engine will be going into a really sweet 69 Camaro built as a pro street car. Besides being beautiful, this is a well-built car that's had Chris Austin Chassis Works components installed along with big tubs and mile-wide meats. You can look at a build like this and know it's just begging for big horsepower. So the plan is to build a big honking 454 cubic inch LS. That'll require a bore of 4 1/8 inches and a 4 1/4 inch stroke, which is hard to achieve with a stock block and wind up with a dependable product. Instead, Prestige chose one of Racing Head Services' LS tall deck aluminum race blocks. Instead of the standard LS 9-inch 240 thousandths deck height, the RHS's deck is just over a 1/2 inch taller at 9 inches 750 thousandths. Even though it's painted shiny black, this is an aluminum block. It also has several changes like a raised cam and oil galleries moved outward to help it accept a stroke as extreme as 4 inches 600 thousandths. Underneath, the main caps are billet steel and use the same 6-fastener setup for each cap as a standard LS. There's also large windows between the caps and the skirts for better bay-to-bay breathing to help minimize windage. Interestingly, and some other aluminum blocks also do this, but the inner cam bores use C-clips on either side of the cam bearings that lock into the grooves in the block to ensure the bearings stay in place. Up top, you can see the holes for extra head bolt fasteners above each cylinder bore. These are super helpful when running boost like we will be, and I'll show you more about that soon. But do notice the large windows in the valley around each of the lifter bores. This is a smart feature to help give you better access to the fasteners. The crank we'll be using is a stroker forging from K1, where LS engines topped out with a stroke of 4 inches for the 427 cubic inchers. Our K1 pushes the pistons 4 1/4 inches. It also has the more modern 58 tooth reluctor wheel for better crank position resolution. The pistons are from DSS Racing. Prestige uses DSS in many of their builds, and these are custom slugs with a 29cc dish to help keep the compression ratio down to 9.5 to 1. As I already mentioned, these fit a 4.125 inch bore, and they're designed for extra strength without adding too much beef thanks to gussets or ribs underneath. The wrist pins are really heavy duty units to limit flex, and the pistons are drilled for forced pin oiling to eliminate galling in the pin bores. Connecting those pistons to the crank will be a set of Eagle H-beam connecting rods forged from 4340 steel. These rods are 6 inches 460 thousandths long with a 927 pin and a 2-inch 100 thousandths big end. They've already been outfitted with a set of King's XP Series narrowed rod bearings, and short block specialist Cody McCleary begins connecting the rods to the pistons. The ring package is sized at 1.2 millimeters for the first and second rings and 3 millimeters for the oil ring. Because we'll be operating under boost, the gaps have been opened up to 30 thousandths for the first ring and 32 thousandths for the second. Once all that's done and the bearing clearances are confirmed, final assembly can begin. The crank is wiped down one last time, the King main bearings are given a good coat of assembly lube, and the big K1 crank is gently lowered into position. RHS includes high-strength ARP main studs with their block, and everything was fitted up when Prestige machined and blueprinted the block. but Cody removed all the main studs to eliminate any chance of scratching one of the crank's main journals during installation. Now they are threaded back into place and the caps are dropped into their respective spots. Then the big mains are all torqued to 70 pounds with extreme pressure lube on the threads. The LS's side bolts for the main caps are great for adding rigidity to the block. But if you aren't careful, oil can weep past the threads and leave a mess on your shop floor. To eliminate that possibility, a thin bead of silicone on both sides of the washer will seal up this potential leak path. Once they're all threaded in, Cody torques those smaller bolts to 20 pounds each. Now we're ready to move on to the pistons and rods. Cody applies a light coat of motor oil to the piston skirts and ring lands, double checks to make sure that the ring gaps are offset, and slides the assembly into the ring compressor. Then each piston is gently eased into its appropriate hole, and the 7/16 inch ARP 2000 rod bolts are torqued to 75 pounds. This angle, you can see the notches RHS cuts into the bottom of the extra deep cylinder bores. These are to make room for the big end of the connecting rods to swing by in extra long stroker assembly. The camshaft is a custom ground hydraulic roller from Comp Cams. It has 243 and 259 degrees of duration at 50 thousandths tappet lift for the intakes and exhausts respectively. The cam is also ground on a 110 degree center line with a lobe separation angle of 116 degrees. Lobe lift is 385 thousandths for the intakes and 391 for the exhausts. So, with a 1.7 to 1 rocker ratio, that comes out to a gross valve lift of 654 thousandths for the intakes and 664 for the exhausts. Lead engine assembler Larry Broker slides the cam almost all the way in while it's still mostly dry. Then he paints the cam journals and the lobes with assembly lube before sending the cam on home. This way he is sure that every journal is properly lubricated and no journal gets wiped dry as the cam is installed. The RHS block uses its own cam retainer plate. Because of the raised cam tunnel used to make room for stroker combos, it also requires a special timing set. The cam tunnel is 388 thousandths of an inch higher, which equals 2 extra links in the timing chain. Now you can get a set with a longer timing chain direct from RHS or from tons of other places. The oil pump is a high volume, high pressure unit for milling. The stock pump can go into cavitation at 6,500 RPM or so, maybe even a little higher, but it'll cause a drop in oil pressure. This isn't a worry with the more performance-oriented milling pump. Once the front cover is on, Larry can turn his attention to sealing up the bottom of the engine. At this point, we already have a pickup bolted up for a rear sump pan. A thin bead of silicone where the front and rear covers made up to the block will help prevent oil leaks, and then the gasket is ready to go on. The oil pan is a steel unit from Moroso, built for both drag and road racing, thanks to baffles that help hold oil around the pickup. It has a 7-quart capacity and extra clearance to handle a stroke of up to 4 1/4 inches. Once the oil pan is bolted down, Larry spins the motor right side up and lubricates the lifter bores before installing the lifters. We'll be using a set of tie bar hydraulic roller lifters. These .842 inch diameter lifters from Gatorman Products utilize tie bars to keep them from spinning in the bores. That's necessary because the RHS block will not accept the standard LS lifter trays that lock stock lifters into position. So in they go. The cylinder heads are Prestige Motorsports' own LS7, LS3 style castings. These are fully CNC cut heads built for performance. They feature a modern, highly efficient 69cc combustion chamber and 255cc intake ports. Now that's pretty big, but it's perfect for our big inch boosted build. Prestige has gone with Manley for the valves. The intakes are Manley's severe duty stainless steel valves sized at 2 inches 165 thousandths. And because the exhaust valves will see extreme heat from both the blower and the exhaust gases rushing past, they've gone with Inconel instead of stainless thanks to its better heat resistance. The exhausts are sized at 1 inch 590 thousandths and both have an 8mm stem. The valve springs are from pack springs and held in place with steel retainers. With an installed height of 1.78 inches, the springs have 155 pounds of pressure on the seats and 425 over the nose. When you're going to be running boost, it's always a good idea to do everything you can to make sure you don't lift the heads and blow a head gasket. To that end, we'll be using a set of multi-layer steel gaskets from Cometic and head studs from ARP. But not all the studs thread into the block. One of the cool things about this block and head combo, and some other performance-oriented heads and blocks do this too, is that 4 extra head studs thread directly into each cylinder head like you see here. These studs are smaller by necessity, but they are located directly above each combustion chamber, which is very helpful when it comes to maintaining a good seal between the deck of the head and the block. When the head goes on, these studs slot into bosses cast into the block just above the lifters. Here you can see those bosses better in this shot of the bare block. Anyhow, once the heads are on, the washers and nuts can be threaded onto the ARP head studs and everything torqued into place. The large studs pull to 90 pounds, while the smaller studs on the edges are pulled to 28. Next, Larry measures for the proper pushrod length. With the raised cam, this engine will take shorter pushrods than usual. After measuring, Larry settled on a set of 8-inch, 450 thousandths long pushrods with 5/16 inch diameter and 80 thousandths wall thickness. The rockers are stock style units from SBI, but they do have an upgraded roller trunnion bearing for better dependability. The intake rockers are offset for LS3 and LS7 cylinder heads. Larry applies thread sealer to the intake rockers because the threaded holes for mounting them sometimes break into the intake ports. And then the rocker bolts are torqued to 25 pounds. Now we're finally ready to begin with the Whipple Supercharger installation. But the Whipple intake is designed to work on a standard deck block, and the raised deck on our RHS block moves the cylinder heads too far apart. Thankfully, however, RHS understood this scenario might come up and offers these 1/2-inch billet intake spacers to allow standard intake manifolds to fit on their raised deck blocks. As you can see, the spacers even come with O-rings around each of the intake ports, so extra intake gaskets aren't needed. Button head bolts sit nice and low so they won't be in the way once the intake manifold is dropped into place. And here's the cast aluminum lower intake manifold. You can see it fits perfectly with the intake spacers and has a wide open plenum. Since LS engines use a separate lifter valley cover, we aren't worried about the height of the intake manifold over the block. That big void in the lower plenum isn't by accident. It's there to create room for the air-to-water intercooler, which you can see here. An O-ring that fits in the groove of the lower plenum will provide the seal. Larry carefully lowers the intercooler into position and gently runs the bolts down. Then the surface that mates to the blower itself also gets an O-ring. And if you're wondering, the water inlet and outlet ports for the intercooler are on the back right here. And here's a look at the blower. If you look at it from the underside, you can get a glimpse of the helical gears where it pushes the air through the back of the case. It's this curve that gives the twisted screw supercharger its improved efficiency versus a roots blower with its relatively straight lobes. Instead of a burst panel, the unit uses an air bypass that mounts to the underside of the blower just behind the intake. It seals to a port extending from the lower plenum. So, if there's a situation where there's too much pressure inside the plenum, the pressure differential opens up the air bypass where it can flow back into the intake port in front of the supercharger screws. What's cool about this particular design is it's a front breather, but it doesn't require a jack shaft that runs the length of the blower to spin the screws from the back. Instead, the incoming air flows right around the drive shaft, which has been narrowed to keep from obstructing the incoming airflow. And then a handful of bolts on both sides and we're done. Easy peasy. For most of their LS builds, Prestige uses Motion Raceworks' excellent billet valve covers. They provide plenty of clearance if you're running aftermarket rockers. In the back, that's an AN fitting that will run a line to a catch can, and up front is a billet cap for oil fill. Now we'll turn our attention to actually spinning up the big Whipple. While we were shooting this, the only people that had a front drive system that worked with the new 3-liter Whipple Supercharger was Wegner Automotive. That may still be true as you watch this, but that's okay because the guys at Wegner's came up with a really well-designed system. The main pulley is built into the ATI damper. As you can see, the Wegner front drive system uses a ribbed serpentine belt to spin the supercharger. It's an extra wide 10 rib setup. Now, normally, I'm a little wary of serpentine belts spinning a supercharger because they can slip. A cog belt won't slip, but they do have more drag than a serpentine. But when it comes to this setup, thanks to smart idler pulley placement, the guys at Wegner have managed to wrap the belts around both the crank and the blower pulleys so that they get pretty much 180 degrees worth of contact. That's pretty impressive, and that much contact makes me feel confident that belt slippage shouldn't be an issue. Right now, we're just using the accessory drive to spin an alternator with a smaller pulley bolted to the front of the damper. But the alternator pulley too gets plenty of wrap. Whipple provides fuel rails that fit with the system. For injectors, Prestige went with a set from Fuel Injector Clinic because they always match all 8 injectors to each other before shipping. These are capable of pumping 1,200 cc's of fuel per minute each. And then the last thing to do before we're ready for the dyno is to add a method of controlling the air. Larry bolts up a drive-by-wire unit from Nick Williams Performance. This throttle body has a 102mm throat to flow plenty of air, and it will plug right in and run with the Holley Terminator X Max engine management system we'll be using. So, here we are. It's time for the payoff with a little dyno session. Now, I love how compact the entire Whipple system is, complete with a built-in intercooler. For lots of cars, it'll all fit underneath the hood, or at most, you may need to go with a 2 or 3 inch cowl. Anyhow, after break-in and a full checkup, we're finally ready to put her to work. Enough talk. Time to go. On the dyno, we pulled the big 454 cubic inch LS from 3,400 RPM to 6,700. Now this is a street build, so we're only burning 93 octane pump gas. No cheating with race gas just to get a good number. With a 3.05 inch top pulley, we saw between a little over 10.5 to just over 12 pounds of boost. Now that's pretty much right in the sweet spot for pump gas, and the results are spectacular. 931 foot-pounds of torque at 4,100 RPM and 1,035.8 horsepower at 6,500. But the peak numbers only tell part of the story. The torque curve averages 897 foot-pounds throughout the pull. That's more than the peak number you're going to see for almost anything else out there on the street. And we're breaking the 1,000 horsepower mark at 5,900 RPM and never looking back. This is definitely going to make the first-gen Camaro it's going into the king of the street beasts. And since it all fits underneath the hood, nobody will ever even see it coming. Hey, thanks for watching, and make sure to check out our other great engine build videos. See you next time.